Get out of the pool, Grandpa. This isn't a retirement home. Marcus Rivera, 23, blew his whistle aggressively from his lifeguard chair, pointing at the elderly man floating calmly in the resort's deep end. The old man wore simple swim trunks and moved with deliberate, measured strokes that Marcus mistook for weakness. But in exactly 90 seconds, when an 8-year-old girl would slip from the pool's edge and sink like a stone to the 12-foot bottom, that helpless old man would execute a textbook Navy SEAL water rescue that would leave 200 resort guests speechless and change Marcus Rivera's understanding of what real strength looks like forever. Before we dive into this story of respect, courage, and a lesson that was 40 years in the making, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe that age doesn't define ability, hit that subscribe button because this story will remind you that heroes don't always look the part. The Grandview Resort's infinity pool sparkled under the California sun, a masterpiece of engineering that seemed to flow directly into the Pacific Ocean beyond. Families lounged on designer deck chairs while children splashed in the shallow end, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of waves. Frank Morrison, 68, had been swimming laps for 20 minutes, his strokes efficient and rhythmic. His weathered hands cut through the water with surprising grace, each movement conserving energy while maintaining steady progress. Most guests assumed he was just another retiree doing light exercise. They had no idea they were watching a man who had once rescued downed pilots from shark-infested waters off the coast of Somalia. Marcus Rivera adjusted his Ray-Ban sunglasses and shifted in his lifeguard chair, irritated by the old man's persistence. Marcus was in his second summer at the Grandview, having landed the job through his father's connections in resort management. At 23, he considered himself the pool's undisputed authority, young, fit, and certified in water safety. What he lacked in actual rescue experience, he made up for with an oversized ego and an expensive whistle he loved to use. "Seriously, old-timer," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the pool deck. "The shallow end is over there. The deep end is for real swimmers." Frank paused mid-stroke, treading water effortlessly as he looked up at the young lifeguard. His gray eyes held decades of patience, the kind earned through military service and reinforced by raising 3 children. He didn't respond with words, just gave a slight nod and continued his lap. This only irritated Marcus more. He'd grown accustomed to immediate compliance, especially from older guests who usually deferred to his authority. Pool rules were pool rules, and he was the one who enforced them. "Hey!" Marcus stood up in his chair, whistle poised. "I'm talking to you." Several guests turned to watch the commotion. A middle-aged woman in a floppy sun hat whispered to her husband, "That young man is being rather rude." Others pulled out their phones, sensing potential drama worth recording. Frank completed his lap and moved to the pool's edge, placing his hands on the warm concrete. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the kind of calm that comes from facing far more serious confrontations than an overzealous lifeguard. "Is there a problem, son?" Frank's voice was quiet but carried clearly across the water. Marcus climbed down from his chair, his board shorts and tank top displaying the kind of physique that came from gym workouts rather than real-world application. He approached the pool's edge with the swagger of someone who'd never had his authority genuinely challenged. "Yeah, there's a problem," Marcus said, crouching down to Frank's eye level. "You're too old to be swimming in the deep end. It's a liability issue. Hotel policy." Frank's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, but recognition. He'd encountered this type before. Young men drunk on small amounts of power, eager to flex authority they'd never truly earned. "I appreciate your concern," Frank said evenly, "but I'm a strong swimmer, have been for about 50 years. Marcus scoffed. "Look, Grandpa, I don't care how good you think you were back in the day. Right now, you're a drowning risk, and I'm responsible for everyone's safety, so either move to the shallow end or get out of the pool entirely." The pool deck had grown noticeably quieter. Other guests pretended to read their books while actually listening to the confrontation. A few teenagers smirked, enjoying the drama. Marcus fed off the attention, his chest puffing with self-importance. Frank remained calm, though those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. His daughter Sarah had warned him about this, how some young people saw age as weakness, how they couldn't conceive that the elderly man before them might have capabilities beyond their imagination. "Son," Frank said quietly, "I understand you're doing your job, but I assure you, I'm not a safety risk." "That's not your call to make," Marcus shot back. "I'm the one with the certification. I'm the one who'll get blamed if something happens. So move, or I'll have security escort you out." That's when 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez lost her grip. She'd been sitting on the pool's edge in the deep end, her parents distracted by their phones just 15 feet away. The concrete was slippery from chlorinated water, and when she shifted to dangle her legs deeper, physics took over. She slipped forward, her small hands unable to find purchase on the smooth coping. The splash was different from the playful sounds elsewhere in the pool, sharper, more urgent. Emma hit the water at an awkward angle, the surprise and impact disorienting her. Instead of surfacing, she sank. Panic is a terrible thing in water. Instead of the calm, measured movements that might have brought her to the surface, Emma thrashed wildly, her arms and legs working against each other. The more she struggled, the deeper she sank toward the pool's 12-foot bottom. Her parents looked up from their phones just in time to see the last few bubbles break the surface. "Emma!" Maria Rodriguez screamed, jumping to her feet so quickly her lounge chair toppled backward. "She can't swim!" Time slowed to a crawl. Marcus spun toward the emergency, his training kicking in, but he was 15 feet from the water's edge. In his mind, he calculated the time needed to reach his rescue equipment, dive in, and reach the child. Precious seconds that might be too many. Frank Morrison didn't hesitate. Without a word, without a splash of panic, he pushed off from the pool wall and dove. Not the awkward, desperate dive of a panicked bystander, but the fluid, purposeful entry of a man who'd spent decades perfecting his technique in far more dangerous waters. He cut through the chlorinated water like a blade, his form textbook perfect, arms extended, body streamlined, descending at an angle that would intercept Emma's sinking trajectory with mathematical precision. Marcus stood frozen, whistle halfway to his mouth, watching something he'd never seen before. A true professional at work. Frank reached Emma in less than 10 seconds. Instead of grabbing desperately like an amateur might, he approached from below and behind, one arm sliding under her chest while his other hand covered her mouth and nose to prevent water intake. It was a technique he'd learned in Navy SEAL training and refined through dozens of real-world rescues. Efficient, safe, and effective. He kicked off from the pool bottom with powerful strokes, his decades of experience showing as he maintained perfect buoyancy control while managing the unconscious child. They surfaced together, Emma coughing and sputtering, but alive. The pool deck erupted. Maria Rodriguez sobbed as Frank carefully transferred Emma to the pool's edge, where her father pulled her to safety. Other guests applauded, their voices mixing with Emma's coughs and her mother's grateful tears. Marcus stood in stunned silence, his whistle forgotten in his hand. Frank's breathing wasn't even labored. He treaded water calmly, watching as the family reunited, ready to assist further if needed, but giving them space for their emotional moment. "Thank you," Maria whispered, holding her daughter tight. "Thank you so much." Frank nodded simply. "She's a brave girl, just needs some swimming lessons." Emma looked at Frank with the wide-eyed wonder that only children possess. "Are you a superhero?" Before Frank could answer, Marcus finally found his voice. How did you, the speed you moved." Frank turned to the young lifeguard, his expression neutral. "Son, that's what 50 years of swimming looks like. But the way you dove, the rescue technique." Marcus trailed off, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. "Where did you learn that?" Frank was already moving toward the pool's ladder, here and there. An older man in a Hawaiian shirt approached the pool's edge. Robert Chen, 72, had been watching the entire scene from his deck chair, and unlike the other guests, recognition dawned on his weathered face. "Frank Morrison," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of respect and disbelief. "I should have recognized that combat swimmer technique." Frank paused on the pool ladder, water dripping from his gray hair. "Bob Chen, Vietnam, Riverine Operations." The two men's eyes met across 4 decades of shared understanding. Robert had been a Navy boat commander during the war, part of the dangerous river patrol missions in the Mekong Delta. He'd worked with SEALs like Frank before. "Gentlemen," Robert announced to the gathering crowd, his voice growing stronger, "you just witnessed a masterclass in water rescue from a man who spent 30 years saving lives for the United States Navy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications sank in. "Navy?" someone asked. Robert nodded solemnly. "Special Forces, the kind of man who could hold his breath for 5 minutes and rescue downed pilots from hostile waters. I've seen Frank Morrison pull 3 men from a sinking helicopter in water so rough it would terrify most people to even look at it." Frank climbed out of the pool, accepting a towel from a nearby guest. He didn't correct Robert's words, didn't embellish them, didn't seek attention. He simply dried his hair and looked around for his sandals. Marcus approached hesitantly, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I had no idea who you were." Frank studied the young man for a moment, seeing not an enemy, but a lesson waiting to be learned. "Son, you shouldn't need to know who someone was to treat them with respect. And you definitely shouldn't assume that age makes someone weak." The crowd had grown, drawn by word of mouth and social media posts that were already going viral. Hotel management arrived, led by director Patricia Williams, who took one look at the scene and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Frank Morrison wasn't just any guest. He was a retired Navy Master Chief, holder of the Silver Star and 3 Bronze Stars, a man whose classified service record included missions that would remain secret for decades to come. More importantly to the Grandview Resort, he was the grandfather of their biggest client, tech billionaire David Morrison, whose company held conventions here annually worth millions in revenue. But Frank had never mentioned his background when he checked in. He'd simply requested a quiet room for a week-long visit with his grandchildren, who were flying in from Seattle for their annual summer trip. Patricia approached carefully, her years in hospitality teaching her to read situations quickly. "Mr. Morrison, I am so sorry for any inconvenience. Is there anything we can do for you?" Frank finished toweling off and slipped on his sandals. The young man was doing his job as he understood it. No harm done. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Morrison, I need to apologize properly. I was completely out of line. I made assumptions based on ignorance." Frank's expression softened slightly. He recognized genuine remorse when he heard it, and he'd spent enough time training young sailors to know that this moment could be either destructive or educational. "Marcus, is it?" Frank asked, reading the young man's name tag. "Yes, sir." "How long have you been a lifeguard?" "2 summers, sir, but I've never had to make an actual rescue." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Real water rescue isn't like the training videos. It happens fast, and every second counts. The fact that you were thinking about safety, even if you went about it wrong, shows you care about the job." Marcus felt a mix of relief and continued shame. "But I disrespected you. I treated you like you were helpless." "You made an assumption based on incomplete information," Frank corrected. "We all do that. The key is learning from it." Frank found a deck chair in the shade and settled down. His granddaughter Sophia, 16, and grandson Jake, 14, finally arriving poolside. They'd been at the resort's arcade when the commotion started, missing the drama entirely. "Grandpa!" Sophia rushed over, having heard fragments of the story from other guests. "Did you really rescue someone?" Frank smiled, the warmth returning to his eyes as he looked at his grandchildren. "Just helped a little girl who fell in the water." Jake, ever the skeptical teenager, crossed his arms. "Everyone's saying you're some kind of Navy hero." "I served in the Navy for 30 years, Frank said simply, "like a lot of people did." Robert Chen approached again, this time with his own grandchildren in tow. "Frank, with your permission, I'd like to share something with these young people." Frank gestured for him to continue. Robert turned to the gathered teenagers and young adults, including Marcus. "In 1973, I was commanding a patrol boat in the Mekong Delta when we came under heavy fire. Our boat was hit, and we were taking on water fast. The river was full of hostile forces, and rescue seemed impossible." He paused, letting the weight of the story settle. 3 Navy SEALs inserted into those hostile waters to extract my crew. They swam through gunfire, dove beneath enemy detection, and pulled 8 men to safety. The mission leader was a young petty officer named Frank Morrison. The poolside crowd had grown to include most of the resort's guests, Cell phones recorded the moment, but respectfully, without the invasive urgency of typical social media content. The point, Robert continued, isn't that Frank is a hero, though he is. The point is that heroes don't announce themselves. They don't wear capes or demand recognition. They're often the quiet person next to you, the one you might overlook or even dismiss. Marcus nodded slowly, the lesson hitting deeper than simple embarrassment. Mr. Morrison, could you teach me about real water rescue? Frank studied the young man, seeing genuine desire to improve rather than mere curiosity. Are you serious about being a better lifeguard, or are you just feeling guilty? Both, honestly, Marcus admitted, but mostly the first one. What I saw you do today. That's what I want to be capable of. Frank smiled for the first time since the incident began. Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Pool opens early for lap swimming. Bring a notebook. Over the following days, Frank Morrison became an unexpected mentor to not just Marcus, but several of the resort's young staff members. His teaching was patient but demanding, emphasizing that real competence came from understanding both one's capabilities and limitations. Marcus learned that Frank's rescue technique that day was actually considered basic by Navy SEAL standards. Impressive to civilians, but routine for someone with his training. The real skill wasn't in the dramatic dive, but in the decades of preparation that made such responses automatic. The incident became a teaching moment that rippled beyond the resort. Videos of Frank's rescue and Robert's subsequent story about their wartime service went viral, but with a different tone than typical social media content. People shared it not for entertainment, but for education. Comments poured in from other veterans, sharing their own stories of being underestimated or overlooked. Young people wrote about reconsidering their assumptions about older adults. Parents used it as a discussion point about respect and hidden wisdom. Emma Rodriguez's family became close friends with Frank, and Emma herself became a strong swimmer under his patient instruction. Marcus completed advanced water rescue certification and eventually became a trainer himself, always beginning his courses with the story of an elderly man who taught him that ability and age operate on different schedules. Frank returned to his quiet life after the vacation, but he'd left something important behind: the understanding that heroism doesn't diminish with age, and that the most powerful lessons often come from the most unexpected teachers. At the resort's annual staff meeting, Marcus shared what he'd learned. Real respect isn't earned through rank or position. It's given freely because you recognize that every person you meet knows something you don't, has experienced something you haven't, and deserves dignity regardless of what they can prove to you. St. Patricia Williams instituted a new policy at the Grandview Resort. Staff members would receive training not just in customer service, but in recognizing and honoring the diverse backgrounds of their guests. The program became a model for other hospitality companies, spreading Frank Morrison's inadvertent lesson far beyond that California poolside. Because sometimes the most important rescues happen on dry land, when one person's wisdom saves another from the drowning weight of their own assumptions. Years later, when Marcus had become a respected head lifeguard at a major beach facility, he would tell new trainees, "Never assume that the person who looks like they need help isn't the one most qualified to provide it." And in quiet moments, when he faced his own challenges, he would remember an elderly man who moved through water like he was born to it, who responded to disrespect with patience, and who proved that strength comes in forms that can't always be measured at first glance. The pool at the Grandview Resort now features a small plaque near the deep end. In honor of those who serve quietly, rescue without recognition, and teach through example rather than words. Frank Morrison never saw the plaque. He probably wouldn't have wanted the attention, but every summer, when children learn to swim in that pool, they're learning in water, where a moment of crisis became a lifetime of wisdom, where a young man's ignorance was transformed into understanding, and where an old soldier's patience created ripples that continue to spread. The deep end, it turns out, was never about the water. It was about the depth of character revealed when the surface of assumptions is finally broken. If this story of unexpected heroism and the power of respect touched you, subscribe to Untold Valor Stories. Share it with someone who needs to remember that strength comes in many forms, and that the person next to you might just be the hero you never recognized. We'll see you in the next story, where courage meets humility, and honor runs deeper than any pool.